Okay, great.
So,
Hello, folks. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, Cynthia. So, you're here at our webinar, Voting for a Just Transition. This webinar is one in a series of climate care and community. The setup today for Zoom, our presentation will be recorded and posted to the Alaska Center website in the future, and we are also going to be posting to Facebook. Audience members are muted upon entry to give speakers space, but you can still engage by introducing yourself in the chat. Tell us 3 things: your name, your pronouns, and the indigenous lands you've gotten nourishment from. As for me, my name's Chanel. I use she, her pronouns, and I've gotten a lot of nourishment from Tlingit lands. I was born there. I went to high school there in Sitka, and I just love the berries there. And herring eggs, they're lovely. Yeah, and some best practices for this Zoom. You can ask any questions at any time in the chat box. We will address them and collect them and address them at the end. Anne will be doing that for us. You can use speaker view in the top right-hand corner to best see this presentation. And with that, let's get started with what we have up today with the run of show. So at the very start of our show, we're going to do a land acknowledgement and just transition with Evan Anderson. Then we're going to hear about the voter role in successes of these goals, of our goals, from Emily Berenbacher. She'll be showing us a lot of voting data. Then we're going to recenter ourselves in the present and hear about some goals we can align with from the Climate Action Leadership Team recommendations from Sam Schimmel. And after that, using language from these recommendations, I will be talking about how to ask questions about climate with candidates using candidate profiles. Then we'll launch into Make a Plan to Vote with Evan again, and finding your contacts, your candidate contact information, using an Alaska Center Election Center online tool. After that, we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. And with that, let's launch in. Evan, are you ready?
Sure am. Thanks, Chanel. Welcome again, everyone. I dropped my intro in the chat, and I look forward to seeing others' intros in there as well. But verbally, my name's Evan, and I use they, them pronouns, and I'm calling in from the unceded territories of the Dena'ina peoples here in Anchorage and Tagayakuk. And I'd like to acknowledge, and I have a tendency, and maybe some others on the call share this, of when I'm looking at the screen or like all day on Zoom calls, that I could twist my whole body up and, I'm like crunched up and looking at things. And so before I begin, I'd like to just like remind folks, or give a gentle reminder, I'd say for folks to have your feet flat on the floor. Think about, straightening that spine. I don't know if anyone on the call has been a singer or a musician, but our bodies are our instruments for any kind of work or any kind of labor we're doing. So I'd like to think about where you are in the space and where your feet are currently, and acknowledge that we, calling in from the Alaska Center, all working from home right now, are on the unceded traditional and contemporary lands of the Dena'ina, the Dena'ina, Lower Tanana, and Sugpiaq peoples. And there may be others on the call who are calling in from additional traditional territories within Alaska, or potentially across the continent, depending on where folks are calling in from today. And want to acknowledge all of those lands and remind us that they've nourished us in body and spirit. And of course, we plan on returning these nourishments to the best of our abilities, even in the face of institutional and interpersonal forces of colonization. And so I'd like to say Chinan, and take a deep breath with all of you as we express that gratitude. Great. Well, today, the theme of our webinar is voting for a just transition. And just transition is something you're hearing a lot about from us at the Alaska Center and the Alaska Center Education Fund these days. And welcome, Alex. Speaking of just transition, the Just Transition Fellow just joined the call. Thanks for being here. But one of our major big goals working towards a just transition is to bring us from extractive to regenerative economies. In Alaska, we're aware that a lot of our economy relies on maybe just one or two sectors that are reliant on limited numbers of natural resources to pay our bills, to pay our state revenue, and to pay for essential state services for all of our communities. So an example we use a lot today, especially here in Alaska, as we define what just transition means to us, is moving from oil and gas towards renewable energies. And we know it's not an easy conversation. So many of our families work in extractive sectors, but to justly transition, we must transition with these frontline workers and fence line communities first in mind. And that also means identifying and uplifting Indigenous knowledge systems together with local tribes and peoples. So just a gentle reminder, and we have a ton more resources on just transition. We're working with a coalition of organizations to advance this work in Alaska. And maybe we can drop the link in the chat for the just transition work. But with that, these goals and these paths in mind, I want to ground ourselves in the goal of our webinar today, in voter data and how voting and how elections have been successful in the past. So super glad to have Emily Fehrenbacher, a veteran campaigner and data professional here in Alaska. And before I give it away, would you be so kind to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Emily Fehrenbacher. I put in the chat, but she, her, and I am in Anchorage on Dena'ina lands. And I first should apologize if I'm like a little all over the place today, but we're 11 days out from an election right now. And so I feel like I'm just kind of scrambling and doing 15 things at once all the time right now. But I'm super excited to be here, and thanks so much to Evan and Chanel for inviting me. And Chanel, we can go to the next slide. But just a little bit more about my background. That's me when I was a fresh-faced 22-year-old setting foot in Alaska for the first time as an organizer on the Kenai Peninsula, working for, at the time, Mayor Mark Begich, while he was trying to unseat Ted Stevens for US Senate. And I remember, it was 2008, so it was, the year of hope and change. It was a really different time than the one we're living in right now. And basically what my job was to knock on doors and talk to voters and make phone calls and talk to voters to try to get them to vote for Mark Begich for US Senate. And what I realized in that job was that more than talking about one candidate, a lot of the time, what you end up talking to people about and what they actually care about is issues. And so, my first 6 months just wandering around the Kenai, trying to get now former Senator Begich elected, I had so many great conversations and really fell in love with Alaska. And I think that election made me realize how important it is to get people into office that share our beliefs. And you can see from those election results, Mark Begich actually won that election by less than a percentage point. And it really also made me realize that in Alaska, it is the organizing work and the person-to-person contact that does make the difference when it comes to elections. It's not a massive state where, sure, we can talk to a few people, but it's not going to swing the vote one way or another. That has definitely not been my experience, and that's why the next 11 days matter so much. You can go to the next slide, Chanel. So after I worked on that Begich campaign, I started working in the conservation community. And so I've worked on a ton of different issues, everything from coal extraction in the Matsu Valley to the Pebble Mine, which I'm sure most people know about that fight. But I think Pebble is such a great example of why our elections matter. And you can just look at the last few years since Trump took office to really see that. So the Pebble campaign, everybody kind of thought Pebble was dead under the Obama administration. There was an effort by the EPA to use the Clean Water Act to protect Bristol Bay. And then as soon as Trump took office and the EPA and leadership changed, they tried to remove those protections that we had in place. And so really, they had the agencies on Pebble Mine had agencies on their side. They had a lot of our elected leaders on their side. But we had Senator Murkowski and Senator Sullivan who hadn't really taken a position yet on Pebble. And so we organized so much. I mean, Chanel herself probably made 850,000 phone calls to get people to transfer into Senator Murkowski's office. We held rallies all over the state. Tens of thousands of people sent emails. Thousands of people made phone calls. And it wasn't until, we can go to the next slide, Chanel, this election cycle that we've seen Senator Sullivan and Senator Murkowski just in the last week finally say that they do not support the Pebble Mine. And I think a lot of that is because you can't turn on, I don't know if anybody, I think I'm the last person in Anchorage that has cable. But if you're watching cable right now, you cannot turn on the TV without seeing a political ad about the Pebble Mine. It has become like the defining issue in the Senate race this year. And it's really pushed our elected officials to finally take a stand on Pebble. And so that's just another recent example that I thought of for why elections can matter so much for our issues. But I real quick want to talk about ballot initiatives and referendums, which I think is what I was asked to do. So this is a kind of old graph that I didn't update with 2018 because we'll talk about the 2018 ballot initiative kind of on its own. But this is just a look at the past several election cycles and the various ballot initiatives that were proposed during those election cycles. And so you can see anything in red didn't pass, anything in green did pass, but it's not necessarily that those were good or bad for our issues that they did or didn't pass. So a lot of people remember in 2014, for example, when marijuana was legalized, we increased the minimum wage and the Bristol Bay Forever initiative passed, which was an initiative that said if Pebble was permitted, there would be a vote in the legislature on whether or not it should move forward. And so we haven't gotten to that part, but that initiative did pass. And then in 2016, we had the PFD voter initiative, which made it so that anybody who applies for their PFD is registered to vote. And that has been hugely helpful in making sure people are registered, you know, A, just that they are registered, and B, that they're registered in the correct location so that their votes count from the top to bottom of the ballot when they do go to vote. So ballot initiatives are a way where if the legislature isn't taking action or if they take the wrong kind of action, that the public and Alaskans can step up and say, actually, we think that this is how it should be. And so we can go to the next slide, Chanel. And this is if you look at the election data by region, and it looks like this actually got cut off a little, so you can't see what these are, unfortunately. So let me try to pull that up real quick on my screen. So the blue, basically this white line here is 50% of the vote. And so the two initiatives that passed that are above that line are the 2014 Bristol Bay ballot initiative, and then the 2016 PFD initiative. And then the ones that we haven't successfully been able to pass were the 2008 Bristol Bay initiative that failed. It was called the Clean Water Act, the oil tax referendum, which was after the legislature approved the oil tax cuts. It was on a ballot to try to repeal that. It's called a referendum. And unfortunately, that did not succeed. And then the coastal zone management plan, trying to keep that in place. And we were unsuccessful in doing that. So these are the recent kind of last 10-year initiatives that have been pushing forward some kind of conservation agenda and how they did. And real quick on that other slide, you can see that there's actually some trends regionally of how we perform in different regions around the state when it comes to conservation issues. So for example, you can see that always in Southeast Alaska and rural Alaska, we do really well when these our issues are on the ballot versus say, for example, the Matsu is always where it's the hardest for us to do our work. So we can go to the next slide. Another very recent example was the Stand for Salmon initiative that was on the 2018 general ballot. Unfortunately, we lost this fight, even though a lot of us worked really hard on it. And basically the Stand for Salmon initiative, we were trying to put in place some basic salmon habitat protection after the legislature failed to do so. And so unfortunately, if you look at the map, anywhere in green, we lost, anywhere in yellow, we won in those locations. There were a couple districts in Anchorage, but Anchorage is so small, you can't see it on maps. But unfortunately we lost, but if you look at the spending on that ballot initiative, you know, when we went into it, we were thinking, oh yeah, everybody loves salmon. But what we didn't realize was that the opposition was going to spend $10.2 million in advertising against the initiative, largely funded by the oil and other extractive industries. So even though we were able to spend $2.3 million, which is a ton of money on a conservation effort, we still were defeated. But the one thing I will say that I think has been a huge bright spot of that, and you see this over and over again for the past 2 years, is that that campaign really did bring a lot of new people into our work. And so just working on Pebble, for example, when the Army Corps of Engineers had a hearing in Anchorage, I think it was like 1/3 of the people that attended that hearing and the rally that was outside the Denina Center that day had come from the Stand for Salmon campaign. And so they'd been engaged on this one specific election, and then they decided to stick around and continue to work to protect salmon habitat. We can go to the next slide. And so I just really quickly wanted to talk about what's going to be on the ballot now, in case anybody on this call didn't know, but obviously there's the presidential election, as well as what's seeming to be a very close Senate and congressional races. If you read about the polling, it's looking like they're closer than any that we can think of in recent memory. Probably, you know, just as close as 2014 was, potentially 2008 too. There's 20 state Senate seats that are up for grabs, as well as all 40 state House seats. There's 2 ballot initiatives, one about elections reform and one about oil taxes. And then there are all of the judges that will be up for retention as well. And these are actually yesterday's numbers. I think today we're up way more than that. But what's really interesting about this election because of COVID is that so many people are voting by mail and voting early. And so already, as of yesterday, 47,000 votes have been cast in the election. And if you look at those votes and how many people have applied for absentee ballots, 25% of people that are registered in the city of Anchorage have applied to vote by mail, which is crazy if you compare that to previous years. And almost 20% of voters statewide have applied to vote by absentee ballots, which is really incredible, and I think means we're going to see high voter turnout. And you can go to the next slide. And this is what it looks like if you look at the number of absentee ballots. So that 47,000 ballots that have been returned, that top line that's the darker blue is this year's election. And you can see compared to 2018 and 2016, how many more people have already voted in this election compared to previous years. And that's a really good sign, because we want everybody to show up to vote, and the easier it is for people to vote, the more they get into that habit and they become lifetime voters. And so this is really encouraging for us to see this year. And then I think I have my last slide next, but just in 2018, there was a House seat in Fairbanks that was decided by one vote. And that made the difference it could have made a much bigger difference in control of the state house had it gone the other way. But this is not a unique situation. Votes in the state are decided by less than 5 votes all the time. And so I think, if you think about it as you're going to the polls, if you can think of anybody that doesn't vote, like that person literally could become the difference in a state house election, and potentially even, a state senate or the federal senate race or federal congressional race this year. And so I just bring that up again to kind of bring it full circle to my experience when I first moved up here and what we've been seeing lately in our elections. And with that, I can take any questions, or if there's anything I missed, Chanel and Evan, just let me know and I can try to fill in.
So I think we were saving questions to the end, if that works for you. As for me, I really want to say thank you, and I so appreciate you for grounding us in our voter history and bringing us to the present, knowing that like every vote counts, even every single vote counts in making these decisions for our future. With that note on what we can do in the future, I want to bring us to some language from the Climate Action Leadership Team recommendations, and have Sam Schimmel walk us through some policy recommendations that are in line with the idea of a just transition. Sam, are you ready to introduce yourself and move into this?
Of course. Wanga ha'uya Kuya Kamsumet. Hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Sam Schimmel, and I was a former member on Governor Walker's Climate Action Leadership Team, which was a group of about 30 individuals comprised of people from all walks of life in Alaska and all industry, and brought together to create a comprehensive state climate plan that had 2-year dates, well, 3, today, 2030 and 2050. And so I think that we're going to be going through some of these, the recommendations that our group had put together. So next slide, please. Now, the plan was broken up into 6 parts, and this was the first one. And that was communities and partnerships. How do we make sure that our communities, our local communities, our tribal communities are able to kind of have the information they need to be able to adapt to climate change? And how are we making sure that they have the resources that they need to make sure that they can stay where they have been forever? And so out of that, we came up with one of these pillars among many others, which was that we needed to support regional and local entities, as well as municipal and tribal governments, when they're working to plan climate change impacts. Now, the mechanism for this was, I believe, a pool of funding that would have designated funds for these kind of governmental entities to do climate resiliency planning, something that's critically important for many of our coastal and non-coastal communities here. So next slide, please. So the second pillar that we had was kind of how do we ensure in law and ensure in state policy that we recognize the bond between humans and the environment. And that's kind of that traditional idea of we subsist off of the land, the idea of thrivance rather than survival. And so the way that we envision bringing this through to a state level, and again, these are somewhat softer policies, but was using this co-production of knowledge approach, where we took kind of both the best available Western science and the best available indigenous science, or as they like to refer to as knowledge, to monitor and to kind of ensure that we were keeping up and having a strong grasp of what was actually going on the ground in many of our communities. Now, the purpose behind this was that Alaska is a big state. We can't have NOAA and other governmental agencies out there all the time, and many of the times communities don't want them there. And so we rely on the people who are in place who have lived there for thousands upon thousands of years, like my family, to get that data and to get that information out of rural Alaska. And so taking this information and then using that kind of cooperative, co-productional kind of take on this process, we wanted to take that information and then use it to kind of adopt different approaches to combat issues on the ground. This was in an effort to make sure that the state or federal government didn't come into a community and say, this is how it's going to be. But it was saying, what's your problem? How can we help you fix it? What works for you? And this was a high priority of the Native peoples on the climate action leadership team. So next slide, please. As well, one of the things that we grappled with was the reality of Alaska being an oil producing state. We generate a majority of our revenue from oil and gas, and a lot of jobs in the state are derived from that industry. And so we wanted to make sure that we were, one, able to move away from oil and gas in the future, but that there were jobs in place for those people who were kind of systematically unemployed as a result of decarbonization. And so that's where this comes in. We wanted to really support and really prioritize this idea of green investment. Two of the members on the CALT were the CEO of Alaska Village Electric, who does a wonderful job of integrating wind technology into tribal communities all around the state and ensuring that Native peoples are hired in those positions to upkeep those facilities. And then also Isaac Vandenberg, who runs the first green bank here in Alaska, who funds different green initiatives. And so we really wanted to bring that into a state policy, kind of merging private and public sector funding to create opportunities for Alaskans moving forward. And this meant really doing assessments on a number of different pieces. This meant kind of taking an assessment of where we had opportunity for our green and blue economies in the state and how we were going to adapt to climate change. I remember many discussions were had over the opportunity of shipping as sea ice tragically melts in the Arctic, and how we could regulate that to ensure that, one, subsistence was not infringed, and then also economic security was provided for. And so we wanted to task the state and local communities with developing a strategic plan on how we can grow these emerging sectors of clean energy and clean power and renewable business. So next slide, please. So then again, coming back, the fourth pillar, as is a good pillar to have in any real climate action plan, is clean energy, and how we can kind of maximize our reductions in greenhouse gases today, tomorrow, and then moving forward. One of the key priorities that was actually agreed to by everybody on the climate action leadership team. The document was not a document that we voted on, but it was a document that was done through collaboration. We had Janet Weiss, who is the president of BP Alaska, as well as some people from Usabelli Coal and other groups. But it was agreed upon that we wanted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Alaska by 30% from 2005 levels in the next 10 years. And this was something that was pretty universally accepted. And we also wanted to upgrade communities, make sure that buildings and other residences and businesses were able to kind of keep down their costs, one, and then also be more green in that reality. I remember there was a discussion about how can we ensure that Native villages are provided for. I know my community of Gamble, we rely on a large diesel generator in our village to provide us with power, and some people rely on that electricity for heating. And that generator isn't always reliable, and it certainly isn't cheap because you have to barge in fuel. And so we really highlighted this idea that clean energy isn't always more expensive. A lot of the times it can be more reliable and less expensive, and it may have a higher initial investment cost, but over the long term, it saves communities money and is sometimes more reliable. So with that, next slide, please. Then finally, the final two pillars. Number 5 was one of the more important ones that we talked about. And that was, how do you prepare the next generations of Alaskans to attack climate change as a reality? And this was done with the priority of ensuring that climate change is a nonpartisan issue in Alaska. Governor Walker, as you know, was an independent, and so was Lieutenant Governor Malott. And in all of our discussions around education and really throughout the entire process, they talked about this idea of nonpartisanship. How, if we get into partisan politics, then we won't see climate action. But if we can step aside and talk about the impacts to people and their communities, then we can actually get something done. So focus on what's going on in your communities. And so this is where that 5th pillar really came in. We wanted to make sure that communities were, one, being heard, and then that the next generation of Alaskans was being educated in the opportunities of green energy. Right now, I'm heading up the 2020 National Tribal Climate Change Summit. And one of the pieces that we're really pushing for is how to get tribal schools and tribal communities into educating their students around STEM. Because it's very hard to turn down technologies when members of your own community are experts in them. And so that starts with building a pipeline, starting at kind of a young age, starting at elementary school, and making it so that students all across Alaska are able to, when they're 18 or 19 years old, accept positions in higher education and pursue degrees in kind of higher math as well as engineering and science. And then finally, the last pillar that we talked about was investment. How do we create kind of a long-term funding plan for this climate action plan? And how do we make it so that it's amenable to both the state legislature, who would have had to approve this plan, as well as actually getting something done? And this was one of the last issues that we dealt with, and that was that we have realities in the state. Villages like Shishmaref need to be moved, and that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. And where is that money going to come from? And so that's really where this pillar came in, figuring out how we could structure funding regimes so that communities weren't left out or told that there wasn't enough money, or told that the budget just couldn't handle it and that they were going to have to be washed into the sea. So that's really where this whole climate action leadership team's work culminated into. So I think that really summarizes the work that was done.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. That is just a perfect summary of we frontline with Indigenous knowledge, we don't leave communities out, and regardless, we need to do this transition. I also want to highlight that you said this needs to be a nonpartisan effort. And I completely agree, which is why I'm going into this next slide to tell our leaders to act on climate, regardless of partisanship. If we need them to know that this is something we care about, we need to talk to all candidates. So in this section, and again, thank you, Sam, I'm going to be presenting candidate campaigns and profile information, then formulating example questions for them to emphasize, like, regardless of who you are and where you come from, you need to care about this. And then ending with why I care. As examples for each of the audience members to talk to their own candidates and formulate questions and like frontline with, this is an issue and this is an opportunity and we need to work on it. So starting right in, our first candidate profile is from Senate District B. This candidate is Marna Stanford. She is an assembly member with the Fairbanks North Star Borough. She is also the government relations coordinator at Canada Chiefs Conference. She has 3 issue priorities of public education, higher learning, state budget diversification of revenue, and preserving the PFD. So my example with the formula that I had before, having some candidate information, then my question, then why I care about it. The example would be if I have her on the line or if I'm leaving a voicemail, candidate Sanford, you worked for a tribal consortium while also holding local office. How do you plan to support local and tribal governments when you're a state senator to address climate change? I care about this as a tribal member myself, and I feel that we haven't gotten the amount of support that we need from the state. What do you plan to do? Next, also in Senate District B, we have candidate Robert Myers. He's branded himself as a newcomer, and he has past experience as a driver in the commercial tourist industry. His 3 issue priorities would be a PFD restoration, state budget cuts, and limiting abortion. My example for a candidate with this on his profile would be candidate Myers. As a newcomer, you've mentioned you're unhappy with Alaska's economic opportunity, one of the pillars in the climate recommendations. What will you do to support emergent sectors of energy efficiency, renewable energy, and Alaska's blue economy if elected? And that just shows to me if when he answers this is also a part of the sector that we need to pay attention to. Or you can go with a question for both of them, the same question, and then compare side by side their answers. So a place-based question in Senate District B, which is North Pole area. In Senate District B, the air that our families breathe has been ranked the worst in the nation. How will UN adopt an approach that understands ecosystem and food security health as an inherent part of human health? Going back to that human health, one health idea. Then we also have examples from House District 40. So this is candidate Josiah Patkotuk. He has been a project manager at Eskimos Incorporated, a subdivision of ASRC. He's worked with the North Slope Borough Assembly as an assembly member, and he's a board member on the Barrow Utilities Electric Cooperative. His 3 issue priorities on his announcing as a candidate has been local self-determination for tribes and local governments, resource development, and local and private sector partnerships along with the state. My example question for him is, candidate Patkotuk, as a leader in resource development on the slope, what would be the best way to reduce oil, gas, and mining emissions by 30% in the legislature? And then moving on to renewable energies as well. And then his running person, his running opponent is Elizabeth Ferguson, also in District 40. She's been on the Tribal Council at Kotzebue, a representative, Lincoln staff member, one of the directors of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. Her 3 issue priorities are public safety and the rehabilitative process, tribal partnerships, and sustainable resource development. Since she mentions the sustainable resource development on her website, my question is, what incentives do you envision for entrepreneurship in clean energy and food security? Or again, you can go just a place-based question. Since House District 40 is on the North Slope, you can ask as our climate changes, we need to start a transition away from oil and gas. How will you use your power as a representative of House District 40 to ensure our workers can transition to a diversified renewable economy in the long run? And so those are some examples. Now we can move on to making a plan to vote and knowing your own candidates with Evan.
Thanks, Chanel. And I'm Glad to be able to walk folks through a tool that is on our website. So the address is listed there, but it's a long one, so we'll get it in the chat for you as well. And Chanel has offered to guide us through here in real time this tool on our website that will help any voter identify where their polling place is, every candidate that's on their ballot, every issue judge that's on their ballot, and you can make a pledge to vote in there. You can research your whole ballot, and you can also kind of you can quite literally click on your do all your reading on the ballot, click on your favorites, and then print out your your pre-selected. It's not a ballot you go to vote, but it's just your cheat sheet on if you're voting from home, or if you want to just like get a visual printed out or on the screen. It can do all of those things. So we're really happy to share this with the world, and want to make sure that folks are able to access all like the full tools in there. So it's really simple. You just start by dropping in the address where you are registered to vote. It's important that it is the address where you're registered to vote. Yes, great point, Anne. You actually can take those pieces of paper into the polls. That is legal, but you must take it home with you. Don't leave it behind, and don't share it with anyone else. That would be electioneering. So please don't do that. But yeah, so we've punched in an address here that's in Senate District B. It's Marna. It's the district where the candidates we just mentioned, Marna Sanford and I should remember his name, are running. And we'll see their names here. There's another candidate who's also on the ballot that you'll see. But this is the first screen that you see when you pop in. And you can immediately click over to what's on my ballot, or the voter information center that's going to take you to like finding your polling place and that route, or making a plan to vote. So here you have your very own custom voter guide. Thanks, Chanel, for opening it up. And you can see who's running for president of the United States. You can see who's running for all of the federal offices. I think it's really fascinating to open this up, because a lot of us only hear about, 2 or maybe 3 major candidates who are running. And sometimes it can come as a surprise when you get into the voter booth, or start filling out your ballot from home, and realize that there's a whole bunch of names on there that you maybe have not even considered up until that point. So great way to pre-prepare folks is to look at them all in here. Checking out US Senate, there's an Alaska Independence Party candidate running in addition to Al Gross and Dan Sullivan. So you can check out his positions on the issues. For U.S. House too, you can see all the people who are running for that seat. It's the incumbent Don Young and the independent candidate Lise Galvin, who's been endorsed by the Democratic Party. So if you scroll down in here, you can see sort of what each of these positions do, as well as some position statements for each of the candidates. And what I'll say too is, if you're in here and if you're punching in your information and you don't see super updated information on one of the candidates, let us know. We've looked through here pretty exhaustively, but we may not have checked every single district around the state to make sure it's all in there. So if you see anything on here, let us know. This is our first time using this tool, so still looking for feedback and want to know how it's landing with folks. The last couple things on here, you can see all those issue statements on a ton of issues. So it's really just like a central place to get all that information. If you click down to state candidates, we'll see the state senators that we just mentioned, and you'll see another way to prepare yourself. It's Rob Myers running on the Republican side. In this particular seat, Evan Eads, the independent, just this last week stepped out and endorsed Marna Sanford. So his name is still on the ballot, but he is not actively campaigning or running for that seat. So it's a great way to prepare yourself by looking here. You can see on the state candidates, they might have some fewer issues that they have things on the record for. So if you see things, just definitely let us know. If you click over to Alaska House, I think there's just one candidate running in District 3. He is not the incumbent, but there's a Republican, Mike Prax, running for that seat. And then the last couple selections on here are down in ballot measures and judicial candidates. So it pulls up your address and pulls up all the judicial candidates for that seat, and then the same for the ballot measures. We have 2 statewide ballot measures that you have the option to vote on. So maybe if we can click out of the ballot guide here and go back to the main screen of ballot ready. I think if you click the Alaska Center logo, or yeah, click, this one will take you way back. Oh yeah, perfect. Then there is a pledge to vote button on here, and I'll just leave folks with that one. When you're in here and you've filled out your ballot, you can sign your name digitally, of course, and then click on what your plan is to vote. The other powerful thing about this tool is that it will remind you, you have to select one of those and then click next, and then on the next page will actually be your plan making language, where it will send you text if you give them your phone number, it will send you emails if you give them your email address, to make your plan to return your ballot. So I'll leave folks with that. And thanks again for diving into that tool. I hope folks got a chance to take a look on your own screens. If not, please do it soon. And I'll hand it back to Chanel.
Yeah. Once you have your candidates all ready to go, I'm going to drop a link in the chat for where you can find the information that their contact information that they left with the state. It's called the General Candidate List. It's straight out from the elections website from the Alaska government. And let's see. So that's our program for today. So number one, your vote matters. Number two, here's what you can ask your candidates to do in order to progress climate action in a way that transitions us justly. Number three, here's how you can make a plan to vote, know your candidates, and here's their contact information. We can move on to question and answer for the next 10 minutes if there's any Q&A that's already in the chat. If not, you can put it in there now. Oh, thanks, Janice. I appreciate it. I hope this was helpful to some folks. If you don't have any questions, then I invite you to fiddle around with the Election Center website tool and ask any questions that pop up. Oh yeah, Anne just said if you're on the phone, then you can just jump in with a question too. We have about 10 minutes with questions. If there are none, then we can hop off early in like 5 minutes or something. And you can ask questions about anything. Emily's data, Sam's context on the climate action leadership team.
Looks like a question from Polly. Oh, and another one from David.
Sweet. Let's address them in order. Question for Sam from Polly. What do you recommend for people who want to move the climate action leadership team recommendations forward in 2021? Are you able to, do you have a response right off the bat?
Well, Polly, I think that's an excellent question. The original recommendations that have been produced were kind of waffled into legislative oblivion by the state legislature after Governor Walker didn't win his reelection. And there is still opportunities to highlight and to push for these recommendations. Earlier in this year, I think it was probably in March because it was in the beginning of the lockdowns. I testified in front of the legislature for Representative Hannon, who I believe is from Juneau, about the work of the climate action leadership team. So there is still work being done to try and actuate these recommendations. I think the best way to kind of highlight them and to see if you can get action on them in 2021 is to get involved. Look to places like the Institute of the North, the Arctic Youth Network, as well as other venues which are pushing forward climate action, and ask the simple question of how can I help, which we often don't ask. And I think that will certainly help these issues be solved. So.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I also wanted to mention, like, in response to that, a lot of candidates respond well to hearing you're a voter, because that means they have more like responsibility towards you, because they know you're going to be making decisions later on. So if you can say, like, I voted in every state election in the past 10 years, then that'll have a lot of weight to it as well. Great. On to the next question. David asked, can somebody tackle an explanation of the ballot initiatives? Emily added some stuff to the chat. Can somebody jump in on this?
Yeah, Chanel, I might ask if you would be so kind as to do a screen share and jump us back into Ballot Ready, because I think that's the best place where we can chat about them. Emily is dropping in the some articles, looks like, that are good primers as well. But what we can say from kind of a nonpartisan perspective, you can also find in your Ballot Ready, if you plug in there and see the descriptions, it's all in there. And so for ballot measure 1, we know that's a tax on oil revenue, but it's a really specific tax proposal that would only tax legacy fields or in a specific mileage radius around Prudhoe. And so it doesn't apply to new development, which I know is a major kind of like moneymaker, but also risk-taking piece of the oil economy. And so that was really designed, I think, as a major sort of compromise with producers. But of course, it's if we talked about the money that's been spent on this initiative, I don't have the exact figures, Emily might, but it's an outsized proportion of dollars are being spent largely by oil producers to ensure that this fails. So I think if you scroll a little bit lower, it says a yes vote does this, a no vote does this. A yes vote passes an increase in taxes on specific oil fields that are producing more than 40,000 barrels of oil per day, which essentially only means legacy fields by Prudhoe. And it only is on big producers. It's not on any of those smaller producers either. And a no vote would oppose increasing that tax. And then there's some more reasons below about why vote yes, why vote no. And so I'd encourage folks to check those out. We can scroll over to ballot measure 2, and this one's called the Alaskans for Better Elections Initiative. And this does 3 things, and they're all distinct and like I would say some pretty major changes to our election system. And so they're all sort of listed there in the name, but they're it can be jumbled together when you're just trying to read it all at once. So the first thing it would do is an open primary system. So we currently have a closed, we have a primary system that allows for closed partisan primaries. And that means we have primaries that are essentially one run by the Democratic Party that's open to most all candidates, and another one that's run by the Republican Party that's closed. This act would change our August primary and make it so that any candidates from any parties can run, and only 4 candidates from that primary advance from the primary election to the general. So for some of our bigger seats, I mean, you saw like the 7 candidates that are all running for president. It could be a major chance to winnow that down. For some of the smaller seats, there's some places where there's only one person running, but it would definitely change sort of the nature where we have 1 or 2 parties in particular that are controlling a lot of the names that get to the general election ballot. It would kind of take parties out of the picture. The other piece is a ranked choice voting, and that would be, I think, applied to both the primary and the general election, if I understand it correctly, and means that instead of just voting for one candidate and a winner takes all system, you actually rank all the candidates. So let's say 4 candidates do advance to the general election. Instead of you could vote for just one candidate, just 2 candidates, but thank you, Stacy. It's general only for the ranked choice election. And that means that if your first choice candidate does not win, then the votes go to your second choice candidate, and so on. And there's some like really handy videos and explainers that you can find from this initiative if you want more info outside of this resource. The third piece is a dark money disclosure requirement that would change the way that reporting around specific kinds of elections money are required and require additional disclosures. The initiative doesn't really distinguish between like smaller organizations and bigger ones. And it doesn't distinguish between corporations and organizations in this dark money disclosure requirement. So in my opinion, a big missing piece of this is that it doesn't fully recognize those disclosure, like recognize the outsized spending that we see in our elections, where corporations are the ones that are largely contributing to the multi-million-dollar expenditures that we typically see in major elections. So I think it's a really important one. I think there's of course always more work to be done, but definitely more information available on that one, and happy to take further questions.
Thank you for that explanation. I'm always impressed by how you can do something on the fly. Are there any more questions to wrap this up, or any other different questions?
I see a question from Anne, and we've just got a couple minutes left, but might as well tackle this one. Does ranked choice voting affect other elections, like national elections, like president elections? And the answer is no. The presidential election is still managed by federal law. So our state laws don't impact the presidential election, but it does impact our state candidates up and down ballot, and our like congressional and Senate candidates as well, up and down ballot. So would affect, out of everything we see on here, it would, out of like the 6 seats we're voting on, it would impact 5 currently.
I see. All right. Thank you all, to guest presenters, to Evan, to all you audience members for being here. We don't have anything left on the docket, and it is now 1:59, so we're exactly within time. And I will play some outro music. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, everybody.
Also, I'll talk about this later. Never mind. Thanks, Alexis. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Evan. Thanks, Louie.